Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stacy Peterson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Student and Alumni Engagement at Duke University's Energy Initiative. I also have the honor of moderating this evening's event. Thank you for joining. The Energy Initiative is Duke's interdisciplinary hub for advancing an accessible, affordable, reliable, and clean energy system. The initiative reaches across Duke schools and departments to educate tomorrow's energy innovators, to develop new solutions through research, and to improve energy decisions by engaging business and government leaders. This event is co-sponsored by the Fuqua School of Business's Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment, EDGE, and I want to thank them for their support and partnership on this annual event. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists, all of whom we are also fortunate to be able to say are Duke alumni. First, I want to introduce Sarah Bogdan. Sarah is the head of sustainability and ESG at JetBlue Airways. Second, I have Manisha Shah, the founder of MStar Consulting. Elizabeth Liedl Turnbull, the senior product developer, transportation electrification at Portland General Electric. And finally, Dr. Tiffany Wilson, a data scientist at Clean Choice Energy. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited to hear from you and to have you here across various time zones. So I'd like to get us started with just an introduction. Would each of you please spend a few minutes telling us your story? Starting from your undergraduate degree, what path led you to your current role, and what do you do in your current role? Sarah, we'll get started with you.
Sure, thank you so much. Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Again, I am Sarah Bogdan. I currently head up sustainability and ESG for JetBlue, an airline and travel company. We have two subsidiaries I can tell you about later, based out of New York City. And I am a MEM alum from already 6 years ago, from 2015. So starting with my background, actually sometimes reflects back on my career and marvel at how I ended up in the aviation industry, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I started in the field as a researcher of climate change impacts. So I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley, was working over at Stanford's Environmental Institute, studying how wildlife is impacted by a warming climate, and had a few takeaways. I think two of them being, one, that continuously studying a problem wasn't really for me. I really wanted to be a part of the solution. And two, that there was this massive divide between what the academic community was saying about climate change and what my peers and the public understood. And I think it's gotten a little bit better, but I went to go pursue this second interest of mine around science and climate communication after I graduated from undergrad, and spent 2 years working in science research publishing for a nonprofit open access publisher. For anyone who is published, it's called PLOS, the Public Library of Science. I thought it was awesome because it really spoke to breaking down the barriers between the public and legitimate, peer-reviewed, credible scientific information. After about 2 years, though, on the editorial team, thought, okay, I got to get back to environmental and climate stuff. And at that point, had a pretty good sense I wanted to do sustainability, specifically for a business, but I wasn't prepared. So I swear this isn't the sales pitch for going to Duke, since you're mostly already there. But at that point, applied to Duke and did my 2-year program, and pretty quickly fell into, I was working for a professor, Dr. Jay Golden, who I believe isn't there anymore, but continuing his great work elsewhere. And so fell into a cool community of folks who were studying corporate sustainability. So how do you find that overlap between environmental benefit and business benefit? And spent basically I started in 2014, so in between my first and second year as an intern at JetBlue, which, if you want to talk about finding jobs and internships, I just applied online, didn't even know anybody, so was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to have the interview and get selected. And then from the minute I started there, I kind of never stopped. I started doing my master's thesis, my master's project, I guess as they're called, with JetBlue, and then also did my final semester wrapping up the MEM program and also working full-time in New York. But it helped that I was able to fly back and forth for free. And I actually have a little blip in my career where I left JetBlue and then came back, but I went and moved out to California, where I'm from, and led a sustainability program for a system of hospitals, basically at UCLA Health, and actually loved the work that I did. I found that it was very, very similar to sustainability in an airport setting. Hospitals and airports are very similar. And then, of course, now I never thought all the work around infection control and balancing, energy use and PPE would be so relevant. Unfortunately, that's the reality today, dealing with COVID and airports. But I came back to JetBlue in 2018 and as a manager. And then at some point we can go into the long story, but essentially my predecessor had been leading the team, left the organization last summer. And so since then I've been leading the team and was formally promoted at the end of last year. Was I supposed to talk about what I do at JetBlue also?
Yes, please.
Okay, love to. Great. Asking the question for our panelists. So with that, so what I do, so heading up sustainability and ESG, I suppose I'll kind of draw the line between sustainability versus ESG. And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with what that means in a business setting, I think the way I like to describe it is a sustainability program is more of the conventional way that a business thinks about the environment. And really it asks the question, what is the business's impact on the environment and the communities around us? You could think of arrows going out, right? By JetBlue operating, what is the impact that we have? How many emissions do we produce? The waste that we generate, even stuff like how many playgrounds do we build and trees do we plant? Essentially, the impact that we have by operating. On the flip side, ESG asks the question, what is the environment and the communities around us impact on the business? So what are these mega trends across environmental and social issues that the organization did not cause, like climate change, systemic racism, immigration? How do these mega trends impact the business? And how do I, as JetBlue, think about how do I manage these risks and find opportunities at the same time? And often we talk about ESG in the investor lens because they are probably the most focused on a business's risk. But it's been a really, really great tool to think about business resiliency, which has obviously been put to the test in the last year. And so I'll wrap it up. But when I think about the work that I do in sustainability, that's kind of my operational work. So things like rolling out electric vehicles at our airports, bringing sustainable aviation fuels to our aircraft, fuel efficiency projects, really just this hyper focus on decarbonization for obvious reasons. And then on the ESG side is really weighing and surveying risks and then responding to them appropriately and building it into the decision-making mechanisms across the organization. From the top, I also operate a committee specifically on ESG within our board, so making sure that it is fully integrated throughout. I'll pause there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Going in the order in which we started, Manisha, would you share your story with us next?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks for having me. This is a great panel. And I think one of the things I'm going to love about this is sort of the different variety of energy related roles that are represented on the panel. I am a business consultant. I am a general management consultant, and it wasn't sort of a straight line path to either energy or consulting. So I did my undergraduate work in politics and economics at Wake Forest, and then went on to Duke to do my master's in public policy many, many years ago, way before many of the other panelists on this on here today, and ended up in consulting. I started out doing public sector consulting, so I didn't focus on energy specifically back when I was in school. And from public sector consulting, sort of went for a while into financial services, insurance-related consulting, and then probably for the last decade, a little over a decade, I focused on energy. And probably the common thread tying sort of my career together was my interest in public policy and private sector solutions, and sort of the industries that I focused on. Most lately, obviously, energy has related to just the fact that I work either with regulated or quasi-regulated entities, and you're sort of balancing the regulatory aspects, the drivers of public policy that they have to work with, and combine that with sort of their investor face and their investor motives. So I work largely in growth strategy, regulatory strategy with the energy sector. And now increasingly newer business models as we talk about renewables and technology and disruptive forces in energy and transition.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Manisha. Elizabeth, you're next.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Turnbull, and my career path has been a little meandering, as I think all panelists on this kind of thing always say. Everybody says, well, here's the way I did it, but I went all over, and if you really wanted to get from A to B quickly, you would have done it this way. And it's like, but you didn't do it that way. So it's okay to meander. So I attended Smith College for undergrad, which is a women's college, which I think is probably foundational to how I see women in the workforce and some of the friendships and relationships that I have. I majored in philosophy, which was a thing that you could do back in 2004 and still find a job. Not that I wouldn't recommend philosophy to anyone today. I then did some stints in environmental and outdoor education. I had grown up going to camp and was really outdoorsy and loved doing that. And then I landed in nonprofit fundraising. I saw a lot of inefficiencies in the nonprofit world and actually came to Fuqua because I thought I wanted to get an MBA and wanted to really bring those business skill sets to nonprofits. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that the issues that were most important to me were environmental issues. So I applied to the Nicholas School halfway through my MBA and added the MEM degree. And at that time, I was really interested in corporate sustainability. And I was also interested in moving back home to Portland, which is where I grew up. So I took an internship one summer, actually working here in Portland on electric vehicles. This was in the summer of 2010, and it was right before the Nissan Leaf came out. There was a lot of energy around, it was Obama administration, a lot of energy around federal funding and, what can we do to be preparing communities for electric vehicles? And that was really interesting to me. I did my master's project on EV stuff. And there weren't any jobs in that when I graduated. And so I landed at Pacific Gas and Electric, where I took a job in corporate sustainability, since that was also of interest. And, I spent a couple of years there and learned a lot about the business, but always sort of followed this electric vehicle thing. And by the time PG&E was building up a team to sort of look at electric vehicles and offerings for customers, I was able to jump over to that team. And then a few years after that, I was still trying to make my way back to Portland and saw a job at PGE, Portland General Electric. It is a different company, very different company in a lot of ways, but also a regulated utility. And so my family and I moved up here, and here's where I am today. And so in product development for transportation electrification, what I do is take a look at what are the solutions that our customers are looking for, whether those are residential customers or business customers, fleet customers, anyone who wants EV charging. And I do a lot of interfacing with customers and with external stakeholders to try to develop offerings for our customers that we can get regulatory approval to offer. It's a lot of work with internal departments because I need to make sure that I've got finance and IT and our sales teams and it seems like every department at PGE. And it's a lot of work also with our regulators directly. And then there's a lot of work with market players as well. So as we think about developing products and programs, whether that's a rebate or something for a charging station, well, we have to come up with a qualified list of which chargers are eligible for that. And so I do a lot of work with sort of players in the market as well. So that's sort of the day-to-day. I am not really a car person, but I'm an EV person. And if it goes, I want to electrify it. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you. Tiffany.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Wilson. I am currently a data scientist at Clean Choice Energy. I'm relatively new to the energy space. I've only been at Clean Choice for about 6 months, but the relationships between human use of natural resources and climate have been kind of a thread throughout my education and career. So it's natural that I ended up at this point. I did my undergraduate work at Princeton in civil and environmental engineering, focusing on hydrology. And after that, I worked doing design engineering and consulting for municipal water utilities. At the time I was in Florida, there was a big drought. So we're dealing with, how do we make the best use out of the water resources that we have? How do we not drain our aquifers, et cetera? And while there, I enjoyed the work, but I realized the people who were doing the really cool stuff all had PhDs. So I decided to apply to Duke, again in civil and environmental engineering. I loved my time at Duke. Obviously learned a lot, met a lot of really cool people, and again, focused on hydrology and the effects that changes in climate have on the cycle of vegetation and water. Again, really enjoyed the research, continued on to do a postdoc at the US Department of Agriculture, looking at vineyards and how to use water efficiently in vineyards so you can produce high quality grapes with using less water. And I really enjoyed the work I was doing there as well. But I was it was a bit of an economic play for me. The pay was not great as a postdoc living in Washington, DC. So when an opportunity came up for me to transition into data science, I took the opportunity. It was a career I was looking at anyway. So I ended up at a travel startup where we were trying to disrupt the travel space by making it easier for people to buy travel for business trips. I really enjoyed that opportunity. It allowed me to get into the data science space and learn a lot about technology that I hadn't learned previously. But of course, when COVID hit last year, we lost about 95% of our travel volume and things went south a bit at the company. So I started looking for other opportunities. And that's when I came across the opportunity at CleanChoice, which made me happy for a number of reasons. One is that I got to return to a space where I was having a positive impact on the environment. So what we do at CleanChoice is we are a retail energy supplier in states that have a deregulated market, meaning that you don't have to just get your energy supplied by your main utility. You can choose who supplies your electricity. So we allow a 100% renewable energy source for people who choose to do that. I work primarily on our digital acquisition, so working on bringing customers through A/B testing on our website, changes in how we do our email campaigns, and really what it boils down to is how do we make it easy to get the largest number of people with clean energy as possible. And that's kind of what gets me out of bed every day. And I really enjoy the work that I'm doing, and I'm excited to be here and share a bit more with all of you.
Thank you so much. I love the common thread of meandering paths, and I love the common thread of, well, maybe not the common thread, but the idea that you all have such different experiences and timelines to share with our group, which I think a lot of people will really appreciate. So thank you for that. So just to get started on some of the other questions that I have here, we don't have to go in any particular order. You guys can feel free to answer the questions as you feel compelled to do so. But the first one that I want to ask is, what did you find most exciting and rewarding about working in the energy sector? And again, anyone can start.
I'll jump in. For me, the most exciting part is working on a collective impact, something small that individuals can do that as a whole have a positive impact on the environment. Something that people often feel frustration, like, I'm just one person, how can I make a difference? But it's really exciting for me to push forward with the idea that you can take a small action that makes a big difference if we all take that action. And that's what I find the most exciting.
So for me, it is, I think what I said a little bit in my introduction, the energy industry in the US, in North America, is pretty incredible. There's a very mature infrastructure that has served the continent really well over, the last century, really supported the way our economy has grown. And today, with the various climate change and the new technologies that have come in, I've watched sort of the evolution of the smart grid. I've watched the evolution of different fossil fuels and onto renewable energy in the course of the industry. It's a very, very challenging thing from a business perspective to take a mature industry and point it towards the challenges of the future. And the interesting thing about the energy industry is, while it is mature, it is something that is absolutely critical and essential to everyone's lives. And anyone who didn't think so only had to look at what happened in Texas a couple of weeks ago to know not only how critical it is to our lives, how important it is going to be going forward. I mean, just again, talking about the panelists on here, Elizabeth's drive for EVs is only going to make electricity that much more important to us. Tiffany's work in the water sector, that there's the water and power nexus that is critical to the country's economy, and Sarah's work in fuels and in ESG, aligns with that. So within consulting, by virtue of being a business consultant, I have the opportunity to work with all of those types of stakeholders, to the energy industry and stakeholders that have an interest in climate change and the industry. So it's to anybody who thinks that this is not an exciting sector to be in, it's something that sort of hits the front page of the journal every other day and is absolutely critical to our lives. And it's an industry that is very, is changing fairly dramatically. So that's exciting to me.
I think Manish is being very kind. When we say mature, we don't normally mean aging, but I think we do have, when we say mature infrastructure, it's aging infrastructure. And, the way we talk about transportation electrification at PGE is this represents the biggest change to the electric grid in a century. And that's really intense for people who have been in this industry for a century. I think as we think about the imperatives we have to address the climate crisis and electrify as much as we can, and then decarbonize as much as we can, that to me is, it's energy is essential because it's in our lives every day. But it's also, this challenge is existential. And so that is what gets me up in the morning and driving towards, what can we do today? What more can we do? What vehicles can I get on the road? What vehicles can I get off the road? And at the same time, I think there's, at least with the utility industry, there are shifting customer expectations. There are new competitors, right? Like the work that Tiffany's doing is a competitive threat to utilities, and which is fine, go for it. But there's also, new technology in this space. And so there's a lot going on. And I think more and more we're seeing that figuring it out is critical. And I think we have a lot of the pieces out there, but actually fitting them all together and making sure that it works in practice and not just in pilots is sort of the next frontier here.
I think on the last one, I echo what everybody said. I'll build on some of the themes. And I'll note this, I think at first when I was invited to the panel, I felt a bit like an imposter in working in the energy industry. I sort of think of myself in the aviation sector, of course, touching sustainability. And I think kind of 2 points. One, as this is obviously a women being awesome in industries that tend to be male dominated, that's absolutely the case in aviation and something that we are working to address. And then 2, I also, have obviously come to realize I work very closely with sustainable aviation fuels and the renewable fuels space, and talking to a lot of oil companies who we give a lot of money to. JetBlue pre-pandemic was only about 5 or 6% of the U.S. Flight, the flights essentially compared to all of the airlines, but we still had a $2 billion a year fuel budget. And so you look at some of the bigger carriers, it's a lot of money we spend and a lot of purchasing power. And it's a little bit down obviously right now, but I think what's really exciting is I'm drawn to industries that have big impact, of course, because there is big opportunity. And right now it truly feels like we're at this boiling point. Having been in the aviation space for the last 7 years, watching, I think, people being better at talking about things, just the level of focus that I see in my own senior leadership, who I'm meeting with on like a weekly basis, because this issue keeps coming up from, policymakers. Our investors are now always asking us, it's like, how's your revenue? How are you going to decarbonize? And then what's your workforce diversity plan? So it's amazing to be at this level. And so I see all this change, and I love that JetBlue and the other airlines that I work with, that we can act as a demand signal. And so we just started flying on sustainable aviation fuels last year, which is great. And we are in the background, and I know my competitors are as well, looking to get whatever we can. I could talk for way too long about the supply and cost issue that we have, but we see this significantly growing. We see more fuel coming online, and it's really exciting to help pave that decarbonization for our industry that really needs it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all of our panelists. It was really, really helpful feedback, and just again, a really nice variety of reasons that this industry is so impactful. So one thing, that we definitely want to address in this panel today is gender diversity in the energy industry. So are there things that you think the industry can do, or maybe is already doing well, to encourage more women to work in and be supported by the industry? And also, do you have any thoughts about what role male allies can play?
I think I'll go first. I mean, again, I've watched this industry evolve over a couple of decades, and both from a consulting perspective as well as from an energy perspective, and neither one of which has had a lot of women participation, female participation, even particularly at the senior levels, right? And it continues to be the case. I mean, a lot of energy is still dominated in the early portions of the recruiting pipeline. There's by men. There's not as many women. I think we're still underrepresented in the energy industry. I do know in utilities that I work with a lot, you are starting to see women continue to stay and rise. So, one of the heartening things for me as my career has progressed, which progressed as a partner in a consulting firm and a managing director at an investment banking firm, neither one of which had immense numbers of women participating among my peers, that it is heartening now to start to at least see that a little bit change in my clients, and seeing women in decision-making positions, women who are starting to move up into the C-suite, a lot in the CFO roles and operator roles in utilities. And, so that is a huge step forward, I think, for the industry. And in terms of what they can do, I think it has to continue to be targeted recruiting. The industry is still, I would say, not as progressive as others in terms of the environment for women. So, there's probably a whole host of work that has to be done in terms of what conversations take place among colleagues, how you support women in the workplace, as families and careers come together and the work-life balance has to be addressed. And I think I do think, though, that a lot of the work will come from the women that have started to become more and more prevalent in middle and senior management to start to change the dialogue, because some of the awareness just doesn't exist in the industry, in my, from what I've observed. That's the part about the male allies. So.
Yeah, I think all of that's really true. I'll say that in the time that I worked at PG&E, and also now in the time that I've worked at PGE, or in slightly before, both those companies increased their policies around work flexibility, increased their PTO packages, and established parental leave policies that they hadn't had prior. So, just looking back at, 9 years or a decade in the utility industry, we're seeing some of those things change. And those things are important to women. And, I looked at a sort of a PTO policy at one point, and my conclusion was this was written for men who, if they are parents, have wives who stay at home. And I would love that. My husband and I talk all the time about how much we desperately need a wife. But
I would agree. I would want to. So.
We should all get wives. Yeah. But I think that that is shifting, and that's really important. And there are a couple instances I can think of men who either vocally or not have been really strong allies in some of this. And a lot of these examples for me are around parenting. There are tons of examples that are not around parenting as well. So, but that's sort of more present for me in the last couple of years. But a couple of years ago, I worked for a guy who had a young kid, and I had a young kid, and his wife also worked, and in a higher power job than he did. And the way they partnered to support their kid and support their family was amazing to me. And when I, also in a home where both of us work full time and have children, he got it all the time in a way that had his wife not worked. It wasn't about the fact that he had a kid. It was that his wife also worked. That was kind of the key to him getting it. And then another example just from the other day, I'm actually moving over to a new team at PGE and have a new manager who's come in externally. And a bunch of us were sitting down with him, and one of my colleagues, who's a newish parent, had his 6-month-old on the phone with him on video. And it was awesome to me, as the only woman on that team so far, that I didn't have to be the first one to do that, that my colleague Joe actually was the one who did that. And I don't even know if he realizes, he didn't do it for me, but I don't know if he realizes how much space that creates for me to be flexible around, I can't be there until 9:15, I'm dropping kids off at daycare or whatever it is.
I'll go next. I guess in the context of aviation, I mentioned definitely certain roles are very gender oriented. And when you look across the organization, because we've looked at our metrics, we're actually pretty even split in terms of 50-50 in terms of gender. But then there's a few themes. I think one, when you look at our senior leadership, you see a drop off in women. It gets to about 32% for JetBlue. And then when you look at our pilots, I don't even know the numbers, but they're more horrifying than that. Not shocking to anybody, but a male-dominated industry. And so I think in the last year that a lot of companies have been confronting these uncomfortable conversations, essentially, or having the uncomfortable conversations is the key piece. And I do think that through the Black Lives Matter movement, we've had a number of discussions around diversity of all sorts, including gender diversity. How do we really analyze the behaviors and the preconceived notions that we have? How do we break this down? I do see a very meaningful shift, at least within my company and from the people I talk to. This is a persisting thing. It wasn't like people sent out a tweet last summer and we called it a day. And so through that, as an example, I mean, JetBlue has set our own target to at least get to 35% for our women in leadership by 2025, which is hard when we are not hiring a lot of people at the moment. But I mean, we've really broken down our process. I think, again, the meat of it is having uncomfortable conversations. There are things that I think we might not realize. And so that's been really helpful for us. I think also, I'm done.
I don't have a whole lot to add on top of what the other panelists have already said, but I will make a note about male allies. I don't think they often realize that they can be gatekeepers who can bring other women in if they just kind of think about like, oh, this is a male-dominated industry. I should make the effort to, instead of, oh, let me get my buddy from school, like, oh, let's think about bringing women in who may be put off by the fact that this whole data science team is men, which is a position that I was previously in. So I would encourage men in the process of hiring, whether that's, entry level all the way up through promoting, to always take that extra step to think like, am I being an ally by allowing women in when it's possible instead of just hiring people who are like me?
I just want to add one thing to all of that, which is just to note that all of that takes on a different lens when you're talking about women of color, and that as much as I feel like I can speak to women in the workplace and things like that, as a white woman, I don't have that intersectional perspective where my intersection is with being white. And so that makes it different. And so I just want to note that, because I think that's an important thing, that not all women in the workplace are treated the same.
I sort of just reinforcing that, Elizabeth, I obviously, again, spent a lot of my career being not only the only woman, but often the only minority in a room full of people. And, if I think an important thing for folks who are out there, listening to the panel today, one, I'd say things have changed. It's not that they aren't changing. They are, things are improving. There's a long way to go, but there is a path to it. The second, I would say, is that, and there is a very distinct difference in the way women and men interface in the corporate workplace and the way they build relationships. And there is, certainly in higher powered positions, there is this tendency for a man, and let's face it, a Caucasian man, to be heard, when you might have said the same thing. And that has absolutely happened. I've been the only in the room. I've heard it happen. I've seen it happen to myself over and over again. That being said, as people get more and more aware of it, that is certainly something that we can all work to change, right? The way we communicate, but also the way our colleagues communicate. And I'd say for me, it's been both colleagues and clients, right, over the years that has made the difference. And I do both, right? As I'm an energy expert, but I'm also I also spend a fair amount of time developing business and developing relationships with very, very senior people in the energy industry. So there's a lot in there in the way relationships are managed and how how those interactions affect things. And when if I feel that a man talks over me as a woman, I am sorry to say, but the man also then tends to talk over you, twice over as a minority woman. So there's definitely that gap that has to be worked out. That's my experience, and again, it's improving. So I would say that it's all sort of horrible out there, but it is improving. But it's definitely something that has to be worked on.
Sarah, Tiffany, anything else to add before we move on? No? Okay. So just a couple of questions about, your role, your job. I think it's important to kind of highlight the diversity that there is in job skills and, backgrounds and things like that are required and expected in the energy industry. So could you talk a little bit about the kinds of skills that are most important in your job? Quantitative, financial modeling, analysis, people skills, communication, stakeholders, subject matter expertise. Where would you slide your experience?
All of the
I
above.
would say, yeah, all of the above.
All of the above. Just briefly from a consulting perspective, you typically start your career and focused more on the quantitative skills, and you tend to layer in the interpersonal and the subject matter expertise as you get more senior in your career. And certainly you need, the interpersonal and the subject matter expertise to sort of continue to succeed and remain at the senior tiers in the consulting industry. So, but you can't get there without having worked through the quantitative stuff and the analytical stuff earlier in your career and having that as a base. Sorry, Elizabeth, go ahead.
No. I mean, I think it's great that we had such similar answers. I think, it's interesting. I do think I use my philosophy degree a lot in this job because a lot of this is about, for me, it's about working out what's the right program. And then it's about pitching it, right? It's about pitching it internally. It's about pitching it to external stakeholders. It's about pitching it to regulators. It might be about framing it, okay, this is a new and different thing, but here's how it's like the things that we've talked about and done before. Here's how we're thinking about it. And that framing is so critical. And that a lot of that, I think, comes from that philosophy degree and not a small amount of intercollegiate debate experience. Financial modeling, I do a little bit less of that. I have a colleague in finance who does that for our team. But I need to understand the model through and through. I need to understand how it's operating, what it's doing, what tweaking it is gonna result in. And then two other things that came to my mind that weren't on your list, Stacy, are first of all, and I found this in corporate sustainability as well, an ability to balance between ambition and incrementalism, and finding that right balance between how far can we push this today versus can we take some small steps, get some small wins, and then build on them in the future. And then lastly, and I think this is so important in the energy space, is equity issues. And that's particularly important for us as a utility. Energy is not an optional cost to households. And so, when we think about that, how much are we going to drive up rates if we do X, Y, and Z incentives? And how do we think about transportation electrification, particularly with that equity lens, so that it's not all just about Tesla drivers, but it's also about micromobility. It's about transit electrification. It's about school bus electrification. It's about fleet electrification to reduce air pollution in impacted communities. So there's a lot around that I think is important to sort of have a grounding in.
As a data scientist, obviously the vast majority of my job is based on analytical skill. However, the interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate results clearly, to, frame a problem, make good recommendations. All of those soft skills are really what drives forward your career in data science. It's plenty of people are smart enough to do the actual analysis work, but it is a lot harder to be able to work with people on various teams to get information that you need or to convey your results. So those soft skills are equally as important. And kind of parallel to what Elizabeth just mentioned about incremental drive, it's important to keep those things in mind as well. Like, we may run a test that improves our conversion rates by 2%, 3%. Like, those are really small, but you have to keep in mind that over time those add up, and they're all building towards our overall goal of a sustainable energy future. So keeping the big goal in mind while you're making small improvements is really important.
And great. My perspective from corporate sustainability, I'd say what's most important is just being really good at the art of getting things done. Ultimately, my job and others who have similar jobs, like, our job is to affect change, which any normal person pushes back when somebody is telling them to do things differently. Especially in aviation, a lot of folks love the industry so much that they're there for their whole lives. And so when some young lady comes in and tells them, you're actually going to taxi that aircraft differently because it's going to save fuel, I think most people, who are good at their jobs should push back and have at least some degree of skepticism, making sure that everything is safe and well thought through. But you also have to, push back and get to a point where you come in armed with data. You point to the other airlines who are doing it. You are saying you understand what they're saying, but the technology has changed since you tried this 10 years ago, et cetera. And more than I like, it does come down to personality is a really key part. You have to strike this balance of being trusted and likable, but also perceived as competent and you know what you're talking about. And then ultimately get to this place of partnership where you are advancing each other's goals. When I think about my time at JetBlue and the analyst manager level, probably more of it was the technical analysis. Spent a lot of time in Excel, not doing anything too crazy. I was not a data scientist myself. And then operations, that's, as working for an airline, obviously spent a lot of time out on the ramp. So literally out with the aircraft, talking to crew members. And so, couldn't be shy. I had to go bounding up to people being like, what did you think about this electric vehicle? Tell me how it could be different. So I'd say that's a big part of it. And the role that I'm in now, it's a lot more of, again, the getting things done and then knowing the stuff. I get a lot of, requests from my senior leaders or on a call and they're like, Sarah, what should be your perspective on this? What does this mean? So that's become really important. And then also just being able to work at the speed of light and balance 25 projects because you have to keep pushing on everything, knowing that not everything will materialize, but enough of them will.
Stacey, if I could, I think Sarah, Elizabeth, and Tiffany all touched on it, right? Which is actually negotiation and the art of compromise. Balance and compromise that's actually the way progress happens ultimately in the corporate sphere. I think to a large extent, even in the policy sphere, right? And that learning to navigate that to move forward is sort of a very critical skill for professional satisfaction if you're really passionate about energy.
Awesome. Thank you all. So there's a lot of really good questions coming in from the audience, and we'll get to a few of those now. So I think let's start with a male ally related question coming from a male undergraduate who's helping to run an energy related campus org. So what are examples of support, resources, and actions that I can actively do to bring more women in at this early stage?
This is a tough one for me because as I think about my undergrad experience, there weren't men. So I would say, keeping these issues top of mind. If you're bringing in speakers, make sure there's a good balance, of men, of women, of white folks, of people of color, that it's not just all gravitating towards, the people who are like you. I don't know if that means, developing relationships with women's organizations at Duke and making sure that they're aware that you're out there and that there are opportunities, sitting down with prospective members or prospective leaders, members of your organization, or saying to women, I think you should run for vice president of this organization next year. I think you should run for president. I think you should, handing those opportunities and encouraging, because I think sometimes women negotiate with ourselves first. And I'm as guilty of it as anyone, perhaps guiltier, but that's not where we should be. And so encouraging people to step up and to take leadership, and then supporting them when they do.
I think you did a really great job on that, Elizabeth. So let's go into an industry, more technical question that I think all of you will have some really good insight on. How do you foresee the long duration energy storage market developing in relation to replacing fossil fuels?
I feel like that's an entire panel in itself. So, well, I mean, it has to, right? Costs are coming down. The technology improves, as you see with any of the renewable fuels and any climate change initiatives, right? I mean, the cost of solar, was large. The sort of penetration of solar was largely about the reduction in costs of solar panels, as well as the financing that was offered. Those were the innovations in the solar industry that really drove distributed generation, and then eventually utility scale solar. You kind of need to see something parallel to that in storage for it to be widespread and adopted. And I think one of the challenges and the barriers is going to be, well, there's two couple of barriers that I can think of. One is sort of the reliance on lithium, and the fact that lithium is kind of the core, not only for energy storage, but also electric vehicle storage, and then every battery that goes into your phone as well. So, over time, there's going to be sustainability questions around mining of lithium. There's going to be sustainability questions about the supply chain of lithium batteries, and whether they're manufactured in China or assembled, or what is sort of each country have. Does it become a transportation and national security issue for North America? So I think those barriers absolutely have to be overcome. And then finally, you're going to see sort of as more and more installations happen, and the learning curve is a big part of the cost curve coming down, and for it becoming a more and more viable alternative to fossil fuels. And I will say, it's somebody I did see that on the Q&A, and Stacey, not to preempt your role, but someone mentioned why there wasn't an oil executive. I've actually spent a fair amount of time working in. I largely work in natural gas, and so there is sort of this question of sustainability. The other question that always is a practical question that all of us have to ask when you're planning power and energy delivery to consumers is energy diversity. Can we all, we cannot be all reliant on just renewables and storage. At some point, sort of what are the other, if it's not fossil fuels, are there fuels beyond that? 100% or 95% of a single fuel is just never going to be a viable, practical answer for something that people are just going to need more and more and more of. So.
Thank you, Manisha. Yeah, there's been a lot of really good stuff in the Q&A. I'm sorry I don't have time to address all these questions, but I think all of you have really been sharing some amazing, diverse answers with us. So really appreciate that. So I do want to get to one final question before we break for the breakout sessions, and that is, do you have any final words of advice to our students, but perhaps especially for women who are interested in energy as they think about going out into the world and starting their careers?
I'd say what everybody else has said on this panel, which is be open to, there is a value to meandering. There's a value to being open to the opportunities as they present themselves. The industry is changing, and the definition of energy is broadening. Again, you can see that by the by the variety of positions and roles that are reflected on this panel. And so, and I will end with something that I learned. I never quite took to heart when I was in graduate school, but certainly understood the value of it over the years from a Duke professor, which was there is also value in finding the right boss as much as finding the right work, and that can apply to a lot of the questions around male allies and the ability to rotate positions and learn different skills, and just a good boss can make all the difference, as well as the right, as well as finding work in an industry you're interested in. So be open.
My advice would be to continue doing things like you're already doing right now, is going to events like this, hearing about different perspectives and different roles within the industry. Ultimately, the Duke network is phenomenal. I've never met anybody but really open, helpful people in the Duke alumni community. So don't be afraid to reach out to alumni, to ask questions, to really flex the network to help you figure out your path and look for opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. My first job at PG&E, it was a Nicholas grad who hired me. I would say sort of two things, and they seem like they're in conflict. So I'm still clearly trying to resolve these things myself. But the first is to be bold. You know more than you think. You are a better leader than you think. You are a better public speaker than you think. Don't undervalue yourself. You deserve more than you think. But the flip side of that is to stay curious. Keep asking questions, keep learning. And that's how you'll continue to prove your value over time. Don't just let something slide in a meeting. Pull that person aside afterwards. Say, what do you mean by that? I didn't understand that analysis. Because you'll go into the next meeting and you'll know more. You'll be connecting more things to it. And then in the third meeting, you'll be explaining it to someone else.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Everyone, I think, needed to hear that today. That was really nice. I'll make 2 points. I think first around LinkedIning, that I don't think that's actually a verb, but I think I did, maybe there was a class or some guidance when I was at the Nick school around the art of, effective LinkedIn connections. And I'll say I am hardly an important person, but as I am somebody who just happens, to work in a really fun industry. So I have probably at any given time, like a few hundred requests or messages. And so I wish I could speak with everybody, and I talk to as many people as I can, but obviously it's just at a certain point not possible. And so the people who I typically do get on the phone with, I really appreciate when somebody reaches out and they say something meaningful about the company or the work that I've done. Like, Sarah, I just saw that you guys announced that you're the first ever, U.S. airline to offset all of your domestic emissions, which, by the way, is true. Have you thought about this, bringing in some other solution? Or, I saw Delta did this, and maybe this could work well for your operation or this other startup. And then I'm excited because I know that you're interested, in this industry specifically. You're not sort of copying and pasting to everybody who has sustainability in their title, and also engaging in conversation. And I always appreciate that. It can be an idea that is just not a great one. Doesn't matter. I have plenty of bad ideas. And so just starting that conversation, I think it's really meaningful. And actually, I think for many of the interns and people who work on my team, that's how the initial connection was made. So of course, use LinkedIn, great tool. And then some guidance I got that stuck with me throughout my time at JetBlue is first, when I was I was an intern and I was working for my boss, my previous boss, so talented, built up the whole program really at JetBlue. And I remember asking her, she's having me work on different projects. And I'd ask her, how did this start? And she'd go, I don't know, I thought of it. And I asked her another one, how did this one start? And she's like, I just thought of it. And that was really helpful because then I was able to feel the confidence of, I see an inefficiency. I see something that some other company is doing in a totally different sector that I think could apply here. And that guides me today. There are no walls within my program. It is truly what we want to do. What are any areas that, of course, should align with our company strategy? But that's been really neat. And then when my boss left last summer, my CEO said to me, be demanding of our time because they're so busy, but that if I don't reach out to them or put things on their calendar or send them things, sometimes they feel like I'm spamming them and they're not responding. They are absolutely noticing, and they were looking for people to lead that. And that's how I've gotten to this place now where we're in consistent, communication. They're bringing me into meetings. And so I encourage everyone to take that approach when you're in the job.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I know we're out of time, but this was very thought-provoking, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us. So really, thanks for coming back to Duke today. To all our guests, including Duke students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends, thank you for joining too, and thank you for all of your questions.